The next point is that next term is that the rental. What is rental? The rental means the periodical payment for use of the another's property. Rent is to pay on monthly basis. If we use the property of another, if anyone use the property of the another, then he has to pay some sort of consideration, and whenever this consideration is paid on monthly basis, it is termed as rent. Such as, if this rent is being paid on business purpose, then such rent covered under GST. That means on such rent GST is leviable. For example, Mr. A owns the residential building in a prime commercial locality. Large vacant land in the backyard is given on rent of rupees 1,80,000 per month to a parking contractor, Mr. B, who has set up a parking facility on that land. So here the owner of that land is Mr. A. Actually, the land is attached to a residential building, and that residential building is located in a prime commercial locality. Now, since the residential property is located in prime commercial locality, the land attached to that building in the backyard area of that residential property is given on rent of rupees 1,80,000 per month to Mr. B, who established a parking facility there. Now, since Mr. B has taken this vacant land on rent, that means the consideration is being discharged on a monthly basis for using of the vacant land. So such consideration is to be termed as rent. And since this vacant land is being used by the Mr. B for commercial purpose, that means here the tenant is being using the land for the commercial purpose of establishing parking facilities there. Here such rent is leviable to GST. That means Mr. A is liable to pay GST on such rent. Now, on the other hand, there is another example. Mr. X, the owner of a residential building in a commercial locality. The ground floor is given on rent to Mr. C on a monthly rent of rupees 60,000. Mr. Y uses the same as his residence. Here it is given rent to Mr. Y, and Mr. Y use the same as his residence. So here the owner of the property is Mr. X. He is the residential house is located in a commercial locality, and the ground floor of the residential property is given on rent to Mr. Y, and Mr. Y use the portion, that means use the let out portion for his residential purpose. Since the tenant use the portion that is being taken on rent not for business purpose, here GST is not leviable on the amount of rent collected by Mr. X. Hence, Mr. X is not liable to pay GST. Now, we have to discuss about lease. What is lease? A lease is an agreement whereby the lessor convey to the lessee in return for a payment or series of payment the right to use an asset for an agreed period of time. So lease is an agreement. Here the lease is an agreement whereby the lessor means the owner of the asset, lessor convey the lessee, that means who is the user of the asset. The owner of the asset convey to the lessee, and in return a payment or series of payment. There may be a payment or series of payment, the right to use an asset for an agreed period of time. So this is the agreement. The owner of the asset convey the user of the asset in return for a payment or series of payment the right to use the asset for a period of time. This is called lease. The lease may be finance lease or operating lease. We know that there are two types of lease, finance lease and operating lease. The finance lease have certain characteristics. In finance lease, the lessee will get the ownership of the leased asset at the end of the lease term. This is the first characteristics of financial lease. Lessee will get the ownership of the leased asset at the end of the lease term. Next characteristics of the financial lease is that the lessee has an option to buy the leased asset at the end of the term at a price which is lower than its expected fair value at the date on which the option will be exercised. This is another characteristic. So there should be an option that preserved by the lessee to acquire the leased asset at the end of the lease term at a price which is lower than the expected fair value at the date when the option will exercise. Third characteristics of the financial lease is that the lease term cover the major part of the life of the asset. That means the lease period cover the major part of the life of the asset. That means if the life of the asset is 10 years, lease period, if the lease period exceeds more than 5 years, then it will be termed as the lease term cover the major part of the life of the asset. And if this characteristic is fulfilled, then such type of lease is to be called as finance lease. Another characteristic of finance lease is that at the beginning of the lease term, the present value of the minimum lease rental covers substantially the initial fair value of the leased asset. Present value of the minimum lease rental will cover substantially the initial fair value of the leased asset, and the asset given on lease to the lessee is of specialized nature and can only be used by the lessee without major modification. So if these 5 characteristics is fulfilled, then this lease is to be treated as finance lease, otherwise the lease will be taken as operating lease. So lease are of two types. Either it may be finance lease or it may be operating lease. Now, what is the example? The example is that Messrs X Bank Limited given an asset under finance lease to Messrs Y Limited. Repayment of the financial lease made by the customer to the bank rupees 80 lakh, which includes a principal amount of rupees 50 lakh. So here total payment is of 80 lakh, out of which principal is 50 lakh and interest is 30 lakh. The financial lease shall be taxable as supply of service. Messrs X Bank Limited is liable to pay GST. So the example is that Messrs X Bank Limited give an asset under finance lease. Here Messrs X Bank Limited is the lessor and Messrs Y Limited is the lessee. the repayment of the finance lease made by the customer to the bank. Here the payment in consideration of the lease is that rupees is amounting to rupees 80 lakh, and which include the principal amount of rupees 50 lakh. Now the question is whether GST is leviable of that amount or not. Here since the lease is of the nature of financial lease, here it is taxable. Here it is being treated as supply of services, and for which Measures X Bank Limited is liable to pay GST. Now another term is disposal. What is disposal? Disposal normally considered as sale of asset when the organization is about to close down and various assets are required to be disposed of. Now such transaction will also be considered as supply of which is liable for GST. So here when an business unit is being shut down, that unit is closing down its operation, the various asset that is being used by that unit is required to be disposed of. Now such disposal, that means the consideration that is being received on disposal of such asset is considered supply. Here the transaction, that means the disposal of the asset, is being treated as supply, and since it is a supply, it is liable to tax under GST law.